strange the change from major to minor every time we say goodbye.
Well, welcome again to our Tuesday evening teaching sessions, an opportunity to view some of the extraordinary things that we find in the biblical section known as the Minor Prophets. We've really set each of the Minor Prophets in the context of two particular significant events. Firstly, the time when post-Solomon, the nation divided into two components, the northern kingdom of Israel, based around Samaria, and then, of course, the southern kingdom of Judah, centered really on Jerusalem. The second key factor in all of this is the significance of the exile, when the northern kingdom and later on the southern kingdom of Judah were taken into exile. That really shaped the context for the writings of the prophets, and particularly these minor prophets. Some of them are pre-exile, as we've already seen, and some of them are post-exile, as again we've already seen. So that kind of sets the context for their messages. Today we're going to hear the words, the prophetic words, of a writer who perhaps is among the least known of prophets, minor prophets, particularly within the Old Testament, and that's Nahum. So I'm going to begin by reading chapter 1 for us this evening. An oracle concerning Nineveh. The book of the vision of Nahum, the Echelshite. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord takes vengeance and is filled with wrath. The Lord takes vengeance on his foes and maintains his wrath among his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power. The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished. His way is in the whirlwind and the storm, and clouds are the dust of his feet. He rebukes the sea and dries it up. He makes all the rivers run dry. Bashan and Carmel wither, and the blossoms of Lebanon fade. The mountains quake before him, and the hills melt away. The earth trembles at his presence, and the world and all who live in it. Who can withstand his indignation? Who can endure his fierce anger? His wrath is poured out like fire. The rocks are shattered before him. The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust him, and but with an overwhelming flood, he makes an end of Nineveh. He will pursue his foes into darkness. Whatever they plot against the Lord, he will bring to an end. Trouble will not come a second time. They will be entangled amongst thorns and drunk from their wine. They will be consumed like dry stubbles. From you, O Nineveh, has one come forth who plots evil against the Lord and counsels wickedness. This is what the Lord says. Although they have allies and are numerous, they will be cut off and pass away. Although I have afflicted you, O Judah, I will afflict you no more. Now I will break their yoke from your neck and tear your shackles away. The Lord has given a command concerning you, Nineveh. You will have no descendants to bear your name. I will destroy the carved images and cast idols that are in the temple of your gods. I will prepare your grave for you a vial. Look there on the mountains, the feet of one who brings good news, who proclaims peace. Celebrate your festivals, O Judah, and fulfill your vows. No more will the wicked invade you. They will be completely destroyed. The name Nahum means comfort or consolation. I guess that's tinged with a sense of irony, because initially when you read these 3 chapters, there seems to be very little comfort or consolation in them at all. And of course, it is in essence a message, a prophetic word against the great city of Nineveh, at the hub, at the heart of the Assyrian Empire. But of course, for the people of Judah that Nahum is bringing this message to, this is a message of comfort and consolation, because of course they have already faced some of the wrath of the Assyrian Empire. So for them, it's a message of hope, a hope rooted in the fact that God is going to come to their aid and defend them against the might of the Assyrian Empire. Nahum's message probably comes around 650 BC. History tells us that Nineveh, the great city of Nineveh, was destroyed around about 612 BC. So that kind of sets the context for his message. We know very little about the prophet himself. In verse 1, we're told that he came from Elkosh. No one really knows where that is. There is some speculation that it might be found or part of Capernaum, that region that we often find in the gospel stories where Jesus and his disciples spent a significant amount of times. The actual word Capernaum actually means village of Nahum. So that's why there's some sense that there might well be a link there for us. Unlike many of the minor prophets, indeed many of the prophets who are described as major prophets, significant prophets in terms of the content of their prophetic message, Nahum's message proved to be remarkably popular. You certainly couldn't have said that about some of the other prophets whose messages were not welcomed at all, and they faced a very negative, if not a very violent reaction to what they had to say. Nahum, on the other hand, his message, of course, because it referred to the enemies of Judah, would be a very popular one in that sense. The ancient world was full of the most incredible achievements. Standing out for us, I guess, looking back historically and in terms of archaeology, you have, of course, the great pyramids in Egypt. You have the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. You have the hanging gardens, of course, of Babylon. And you have these great and ancient cities, some of which we are still able to visit today, though often lay now in ruins. But of course, not only was it a world of incredible achievement, but also it was a world of immense brutality and violence. It was a world where sorcery and witchcraft dominated. It was a world where genocide was sadly part of everyday life, where brutality was carried out to levels that almost seem impossible for us to relate to at all. And of course, it was a world where empires came, emerged, and then disappeared from sight. You get this great movement of civilizations and cultures and the clashes that emerge out of them. For the people of Judah, and Judah, of course, was only a very small parcel of land. For the people of Judah at that time, looking out at the ancient world, it was a very terrifying place for them. They had already faced something of the wrath of the Assyrians when Sennacherib brought the forces, the might of Assyria, against Jerusalem and laid siege to the city after Judah had rebelled against the Assyrians and aligned themselves to the Egyptians. Well, they'd already just about survived that. And of course, for them, looking at the world at that time, it was a dark place, a place where there was very little mercy. And of course, for them, it raised all sorts of important questions. Has our God been outdone by the gods of other nations? Has God forsaken his covenant people? Has God indeed broken his covenant promises? Has God been usurped? His throne has been taken by other deities. And so these questions and this overwhelming sense of darkness must have afflicted Judah at that time when Nahum came to bring this significant prophetic message. The fundamental message of Nahum's prophecy is that God remains in control. In truth, he has not been usurped at all. It's a message that brings a ray of hope to the people of Judah who were, unsurprisingly, losing any sense of hope. That God is about to intervene on their behalf. He will not allow Nineveh, as it's seen as part or the center of this great Assyrian empire, he will not allow their might to come against Judah. In fact, quite the reverse. They will ultimately be destroyed. There's a very interesting contrast between the message of Jonah, which we thought about last week, and Nahum's prophetic words here. There's about a 150-year gap between the two. And it's ironic when you think about it that Jonah was given a message to take to Nineveh, which brought about, of course, a very good response. They repented of their failings, much to Jonah's disgust. 150 years later, we learn that that time of repentance was soon forgotten. And at the heart of Nineveh, center, of course, of the Assyrian Empire, evil and a real drive for greed and possession and power had overtaken them once more. And although God was patient over a 150-year period, it is clear from Nahum's prophecy that God's patience had indeed run out. Nineveh was a huge city. Even by modern day standards, it would be considered to be a significant city. It was founded, we're told, in Genesis chapter 10 by Nimrod, and it was located on the eastern banks of the river Tigris. The outer wall, we're told, stretched something like 8 miles. And the city itself, at its height, was something like 3 miles wide and 8 miles long. In ancient world terms, this was a megapolis. Indeed, in modern terms, this was a huge city with suburbs. Remember how we're told that Jonah took 3 days to walk from one end of the city to the other. When it was destroyed in 612 BC by the Babylonians and the Medes, and supported by the Scythians, the city was absolutely wrecked. In fact, such was the devastation that it was almost impossible to see that the city had existed at all. It was buried. And it remained buried probably around until the 50s when archaeologists were working in what is now modern-day Iraq came across the remains of the city. In fact, at that time, right up to that point, people had actually doubted that the city of Nineveh in fact existed. But when the ruins were found, of course, that put pay to that particular view and argument. Today, if you wanted to visit Nineveh, it wouldn't be an easy place to visit because it's right next opposite Mosul in Iraq, a very dangerous place, of course, to visit today. When we begin to move into the beginning of chapter 1 of Nahum's prophecy, we see a number of words that perhaps we find quite difficult to really access in terms of our Christian understanding. The picture that we find there initially is of God who is seen as a jealous God, as an avenging God, as a vengeful God, a God who's described as being filled with wrath. He's a very angry God in that sense. And to make any sense of that for ourselves within our own contexts, we need to unpack exactly how those words are played out as far as God is concerned. Because, of course, for us, all of those words would carry quite negative connotations. Firstly, we need to understand that God is the God of covenant promises, and when he enters into a relationship with the people of Israel, he becomes their protector. He's the God who is there to keep them, to watch over them, to ensure that they don't come to any harm. The metaphor that's often used to describe that is the relationship between a husband and wife. God is the husband, the wife is Israel, and the husband's role is to jealously guard and watch over and protect his people. So in that sense, although the word has quite negative connotations for us, we're discovering here, I think, that it's not that sense of jealousy or envy that we're talking about. Here we're talking about somebody, God himself, who is deeply, deeply protective, jealously protective of his own people. He will stand no rivals. We find that, of course, in the first commandments, you shall have no other gods before me. It reminds us that God will not tolerate rivals. His jealousy demands that he protects his people, but that his people remain true to him. So it's a very different understanding to some of the ways it's played out in our modern culture and understanding today. But even when we see this image of God as a jealous, avenging, vengeful, filled with wrath and angry God, we need to see that Scripture tells us that that is tempered by one or two things. The first thing is God's patience. God is incredibly long-suffering and patient. He never flies off the handle. He never has a bad hair day. He never loses it under stress or tiredness or pressure. And for Nineveh, Nahum wants to tell us, it's been 150 years of long suffering and patience as far as God is concerned. He's not made a snap decision to destroy this city. The second thing that we're told tempers our understanding of God in the light of some of those words is that God is a God of justice. God is, always has been, and always will be true in himself, true to himself, and he truly is a God of righteous justice. He does no wrong. He never reacts in an unjust way. He's always true to himself in that sense. He's a God of mercy. And being merciful implies that you hold to the values of what is right and what is wrong. He's a just God in that sense. And when his judgments come, his judgments are right and true and just. They're never wrong. He's never misread the situation. He always is compelled by his desire for greater justice. And sometimes for justice to be played out in our world, something decisive has to happen. And here we see in terms of Nahum's prophecy that decisiveness will be seen in the way that God acts towards the great city of Nineveh. The destruction of Nineveh is the result, the outcome of his drive for righteous justice in our world. Moving on into chapter 1, we begin to see in verses 3 through to 6 that God is very much seen as an active God. He's the God who acts. And Nahum helps us to grasp that by presenting a number of images that were very familiar to people in the ancient world. He pictures the way that armies acted and responded towards their enemies. And here we can see as the Babylonians and the Medes and the Scythians come to destroy Nineveh, you can see that the imagery that Nahum is trying to get across is just helping us to grasp something of the force and the sheer destructiveness of what's about to happen. It feels like a whirlwind. It's like a drought that has hit them hard. It's like an earthquake that has destroyed everything. It's like a flood that has taken out their defenses, and so on. So Nahum is using imagery very familiar to people in the ancient world, and it really helps us to grasp the total destruction of Nineveh in a way that we can access and gain some understanding of it. In verses 7 to 8 of chapter 1, we find that Nineveh has had that opportunity. We talked about the 150 years. That's a long time. It's a big opportunity, of course, to put things right with God. But the truth is, as we see here in this prophecy, that they have rejected that opportunity. And verse 8, I think, helps us to understand some of the processes that took place when Nineveh itself was destroyed. Prior to the Babylonian forces with their allies arriving to destroy the city, the river Tigris had burst its banks, and the flooding was so devastating that it actually weakened the defenses, the fortified defenses of the city. It was almost as if this was the prelude to invasion. And so when the Babylonians and their allies come against the city is almost easy for them to access and to overpower in that sense. When you look at a map or a diagram that shows the extent of the Assyrian Empire as it was in the ancient world, you begin then to grasp, I think, something of the seismic implications of what was about to happen. Assyria was no small empire. It was huge, and it dominated the whole of the ancient world. Everyone had to pay tribute to it. Its wealth and strength was beyond formidable. It was a superpower at that time. It was a superpower of that age. And so its destruction would have been considered impossible. But of course, here Nahum clearly says, well, it's going to happen. God is going to bring it about. The reference to the one in verse 11 probably is to Sennacherib. If you remember, in 701 BC, Sennacherib had led the forces of Assyria against the city of Jerusalem. He never took the city because although he laid siege to it, he soon discovered that a coup was taking place back home, and so he quickly had to return home. But of course, that brought that sense of the danger and the threat, the continuous threat that the people of Judah were facing. Verse 14 helps us to grasp something about the way that God moves when he moves in judgment. And here we're told he's going to move to bring about total destruction. The city will be literally buried, as history has shown us. Today, the remains of the city can be accessed, but they are a very stark reminder that if people are not doing things God's way, if people are exploiting others, if they're brutal in the way that they victimize others, then God ultimately will bring about their destruction. And the remains of the city of Nineveh remind us that in a very powerful way. In chapter 2, we find Nahum uses a number of analogies. Primarily in verse 11, we find him using the imagery of the lion. If you're familiar with some of the motifs of the Assyrian Empire, you'll be very familiar with the fact that a lion was very much an image which they valued. The lion is pictured as ferocious, likely to pounce at any moment, to be totally feared in that sense. And Nahum pictures the scene of a lion's den where the lion has gone out hunting and then returns to the den and takes with it all its plunder. And of course, that is a reference to the way that the Assyrians dominated the ancient world and captured and took away from so many nations so much wealth and stored it up in its great cities, particularly in the city of Nineveh. In chapter 3, we find some of the characteristics of the nation of Assyria. Firstly, we're finding here in chapter 3 a description of their brutality. Brutality was used as a means of frightening your enemies, keeping them under control. So when Assyria plundered somewhere, attacked somewhere, the destruction and the brutality was on a scale that was unbelievable. And of course, that induced great fear in their opponents. Everything would be destroyed. Men, women, children, even babies would be butchered. Alongside that, in one sense, those that were taken prisoners even faced a worse death. Many of them would have been tortured. Some of them would have been flayed. Some of them would have faced being dragged and pulled apart piece by piece, either by chariots or horses or whatever. It was destructive at a level that goes beyond natural human belief, and all of it, of course, was geared to creating fear. Well, what Nahum has to say is all that you have done to others is about to be turned on you. The second description that Nahum gives us of the people of Assyria, the Assyrian Empire, is he describes them as harlots. Harlots in the sense that they have prostituted themselves before other gods. Their morals and their sense of human dignity has been sold. They've sold their souls, as it were. Everything that truly made them human has been extracted from them over the years. So in that sense, they have prostituted themselves to all sorts of power and control and exploitation. They have put themselves in a place where they are about to be judged by God. They have put themselves outside of that place where there's any chance of them ever returning in that sense. And they're about to reap the fruits of that. They're about to reap the fruits of their the way that they've played the harlot before other gods. The third characteristic is sorcery. The Assyrians will be judged because they have accessed sources of power that the God of Israel made it very clear to his people should not be accessed at all. They were very dangerous and very destructive. They have employed, the Assyrian Empire has employed sorcery and occult practices to seduce and overcome their enemies. They have sought ways of learning their fate, of trying to predict the outcome of their military campaigns. They've sought additional sources of power from places that were well outside of God's power and clearly condemned within Old Testament scripture. So when we come to verse 5, where Nahum says, "For 3 sins, even 4, I will not turn back my wrath," you can see how those 3 characteristics there tap into that particular piece of prophetic writing. In verse 5, we're told their harlotry will be exposed. Like in the ancient world, when a prostitute was caught in the very act of prostitution, they would be stripped naked and then executed. So they would be exposed before the people. And so that's going to be the same for Nineveh. Like the way the Assyrians had captured and taken prisoners who would be mocked and scorned and publicly humiliated. In verse 6, we find that that's about to happen to the Assyrians. Again, in verse 7, just like the person who dies alone with no friends or family to mourn them, so there will be no one who will miss the Assyrians at all. Their allies, the people that they have thought that they have influenced, will not at all come to their help. Chapter 3 finishes with just a view of the great ancient city of Thebes, part of the Egyptian Empire, of course. This was a city that was very much at the heart of the Egyptian Empire, and therefore its position and its power were unquestioned. And Nahum warns the Assyrians, just as the Assyrians had destroyed Thebes, so now the Babylonians are about to destroy the Assyrians. It's almost as if they needed to learn the lesson from Thebes. It's happened there. No one thought it could happen. You think it can't happen to you, but it is about to happen. The great city of Nineveh is about to be destroyed. The brutality of that doesn't really bear thinking about. Assyria is about to pay the price for doing things in a very different way than God would have wanted them to do it, and in a way that neglected their need to put their lives right with God. Another empire was about to fall under the judgment of God, as all empires ultimately do when they do things on a very different set of terms than God's himself, where exploitation and injustice is the way that creates their wealth and their source of power. God will move, Nahum says, in righteous anger and in righteous justice, and bring about judgment on this great ancient city of Nineveh.
When you're near, there's such an air of spring about it. I can hear a lark somewhere begin to sing about it. There's no love song finer, but how strange the change from major to minor every time we say goodbye.